Wyoming Territory, 1876. There is a kind of silence that only exists at the edge of the frontier, the silence before something breaks. Widow's Bend sat in that silence, a scattering of clapboard buildings pressed against the base of the Laramie foothills, where the wind carried dust instead of rain and the sun burned honest men the same as thieves. It was a town built on debt. Every rancher, every shop owner, every family that had staked a claim on that dry red earth owed something to the Colton name, and the Coltons never forgot a debt. At the center of Main Street stood Hartwell's General Store, its faded sign creaking in the wind, and behind its counter, humming a tune her mother used to sing, stood the one thing in Widow's Bend that money couldn't buy, and Silas Colton wanted most. Her name was Abigail Hartwell, and by the time she was 25, men rode 2 days out of their way just to be served a sack of flour by her hands. She had her mother's golden hair and her father's stubborn heart, and she had learned, in a town like this, that beauty was rarely a gift. More often, it was a target painted on your back. Thomas Hartwell, her father, had built this store with calloused hands and an honest ledger, until 3 years of drought and one bad loan from Colton Cattle Company had turned that honest ledger into a noose, slowly tightening around his throat. That morning, like every morning, Abigail swept the porch before opening the doors, watching the sun climb over rooftops that all, in one way or another, belonged to somebody else's mercy. She did not know yet that this would be the last ordinary morning of her life, and if you're the kind of person who likes to know exactly how much trouble is coming before it arrives, you might want to hit that subscribe button now, because trouble in Widow's Bend was about to come wearing a green waistcoat and riding a black stallion, and it had absolutely no intention of knocking. By noon, the whole town had gathered outside the saloon. Not for a hanging, though the mood was close to one. Silas Colton had called a meeting, the kind no one in Widow's Bend dared refuse. Thomas Hartwell stood at the front, hat in hand, the ledger of his debts tucked beneath his arm like a confession he could not stop carrying. Beside the old cattle baron stood his son, Jeremiah Colton, 38 years old, dressed finer than anyone in 3 counties, a man who had never once in his life been told no and taken it seriously. "Thomas," Silas said, his voice carrying easy and cold across the square. "You owe this family $1,100, and near as I can tell, you don't have it." The crowd shifted. Somewhere a dog barked and was quickly hushed. Abigail stood near the store steps, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron, dread rising in her chest like floodwater. "I have 3 more weeks," Thomas said. "The harvest?" "The harvest failed," Silas cut him off. "Same as it did last year. Same as it will next year, most likely, seeing as God himself seems tired of Widow's Bend." Jeremiah stepped forward then, and the whole square seemed to lean in with him, sensing that the real business of the day had only just begun. "There's a way to settle this, old man," Jeremiah said, his eyes drifting past Thomas, past the crowd, landing exactly where they had been aimed the entire time, on Abigail. "A generous way. One that clears your debt and puts your family under Colton protection for good." Thomas went pale. "Jeremiah, don't—" "Your daughter," Jeremiah said simply, as if he were naming the price of grain, "marries me before the first snow, and your debt disappears like it never existed." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Abigail felt the world narrow to a single point of heat behind her eyes. Jeremiah walked toward her, unhurried the way a man walks toward something he already believes he owns, and stopped close enough that she could smell his cologne, sweet and suffocating. He reached out and tilted her chin up with 2 fingers, and in front of the entire town he said the words that would echo through every night that followed. "Now you are ours, Abigail. Best get used to the sound of it." She did not answer. She could not. Her voice had folded itself somewhere deep inside her chest, and all she could do was stand there, humiliated, cornered, while her father's shoulders sank with a grief too heavy for words. It was in that exact silence, the silence right after cruelty finishes speaking and before anyone finds the courage to answer it, that hooves sounded at the far end of Main Street. Every head turned. A lone rider emerged from the shimmer of noon heat, a dark shape against the white sky, moving at an unhurried walk, as if he had all the time in the world and none of it belonged to fear. He wore a long leather duster the color of dried blood, a black hat pulled low, and twin revolvers that caught the sunlight like a warning. No one in Widow's Bend knew his name. No one would, not that day, not for a long while after. He simply rode into town, dismounted in front of the saloon, and let his shadow fall, deliberately, unmistakably, across the table where Jeremiah Colton's men had spread their ledgers like a verdict. "That seat taken?" the stranger asked, his voice low and even, nodding toward the table. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. "This is Colton business, friend. Best you ride on." The stranger's eyes moved once, slow, deliberate, from Jeremiah to Thomas Hartwell's bowed head, to Abigail's tear-bright eyes. Something in his expression did not change, and yet everything about the square suddenly did. "Funny thing about business," the stranger said quietly. "Never did like watching a woman sold at the table like cattle." The silence that followed had teeth in it. Jeremiah forced a laugh, waving a dismissive hand toward his men. "You don't know who you're talking to." "No," the stranger agreed, "but I know exactly what I'm looking at." He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his guns. He simply held Jeremiah's gaze until the other man's bravado cracked at the edges, and with a sharp word to his men, Jeremiah turned and stalked away, the crowd parting before him like water around a stone. That night, the town buzzed with the story of the nameless rider who had stood between the Coltons and the Hartwell girl and lived to walk away. But no one buzzed about it more than Abigail herself, who found an hour before midnight that she could not sleep for thinking of gray-blue eyes. She found him behind the store, sitting on an overturned crate, cleaning a revolver by lantern light, as calm as if the whole afternoon had never happened. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." "Then why did you?" He looked up at her then, and for the first time, something softened behind those cold eyes. "Because somebody should have done it a long time before I got here." They talked until the lantern burned low, about nothing, about everything, about a home he never named, and a grief he carried like a second holster. She learned he had once worn a badge in a town not unlike this one, until the men he swore to protect turned out to be the ones he needed protecting from. "I don't stay in towns," he admitted quietly. "Never long enough to matter." "Maybe this one's different," Abigail said, and surprised herself with how badly she wanted that to be true. But Widow's Bend had never let hope live long, and morning brought its answer swift and cruel. Hartwell's general store, burned to its foundations in the black hours before dawn, smoke still curling from its ashes when Abigail fell to her knees in the street and screamed. Thomas Hartwell survived barely, pulled from the flames by the stranger who had smelled the smoke before anyone else and run through fire to drag the old man out. But the store, the life they had built, was gone. Colton did this, Thomas rasped from his sickbed later that day, his voice raw with smoke. He said if I wouldn't sell her willingly, he'd burn everything else I loved until I had nothing left to protect but her. Something in Abigail broke that day, and something in the stranger, watching her grief, hardened into a decision he had been avoiding since he'd first ridden into town. That evening, beneath a sky bruised orange with the last of sunset, Abigail found him saddling his horse at the edge of town, and for one terrible moment she believed he was leaving. "You're going?" she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "I'm going to end this," he said. "Tomorrow, at noon, in the square, in front of the whole town, so there's no version of this story where Jeremiah Colton gets to lie about what happens next. He'll kill you." "He'll try," the stranger said, and for the first time, he let her see the man beneath the duster, not a legend, not a shadow, but someone afraid of exactly one thing, leaving her the way this town had already left her, with nothing. He reached out, brushed a strand of golden hair from her face, and said the only promise he had ever meant with his whole chest. "I've run from every town I ever called home. I'm done running from this one." Noon came heavy and still. The whole of Widow's Bend pressed into Main Street like a held breath. Jeremiah Colton stood at one end of the square, 4 armed men flanking him, his father watching from the saloon porch with the flat, unbothered eyes of a man who had never once paid for his own cruelty. The stranger walked out alone, duster catching in the dry wind, and stopped exactly in the center of the street. The same table, the same shadow, the same silence he had claimed the day he arrived. "Last chance to ride out," Jeremiah called, though his voice betrayed the first crack of real fear. "This isn't your fight." "It became mine," the stranger said, "the moment you called her yours." The gunfire that followed lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds that the town of Widow's Bend would tell their grandchildren about for the next 50 years. When the dust settled, Jeremiah Colton's men lay disarmed and broken in the street, Jeremiah himself on his knees clutching a shattered hand, and the stranger standing exactly where he had started, untouched, revolver still smoking in his grip. Silas Colton did not reach for a weapon. He simply looked at the man who had beaten his son without raising his voice once, and understood, in the way only old men who have outlived their own power understand, that Widow's Bend no longer belonged to him. By the first snow, the Colton debt had been quietly forgiven. Silas Colton, it turned out, preferred peace to further humiliation. Thomas Hartwell rebuilt his store with the help of half the town, each family finally free to offer what gratitude and debt had never let them offer before. And on the porch of that rebuilt store, beneath a sign painted fresh, Abigail Hartwell stood beside a man who still had no name that Widow's Bend ever learned. Only a promise, kept, and a shadow that had stopped running long enough to finally call somewhere home. If this story warmed something in your chest the way it did in ours, don't forget to subscribe, because Widow's Bend has more stories left to tell, and you won't want to miss the next stranger who rides in with a shadow of his own.